Hello and welcome to this webinar. This is Shane McGlynn of IRM UK, and today I'm joined by Ellie Fitzpatrick, who will be presenting on the data wrestling match. Ellie is the data framework and policy lead at PwC, and like me, hails from Galway in the west of Ireland. Ellie will be presenting a session on this topic at our MDM and Data Governance Conference 2020, which takes place in London from the 2nd to the 5th of November. We welcome your questions via the questions pane. And now over to you, Ellie.
Thanks, Shane. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's data wrestling match. As Shane just said, I'll be presenting this topic in its entirety, and that will be with my colleague Jocelyn Sheriff, who's our data intelligence lead at the conference in November. But today I have an opportunity to take you through a bite-sized version of the presentation. So firstly, just a quick intro to me. I, as well as being from Galway, I joined PwC just over a year ago. My background is, before that, was in financial services and the public sector. I've predominantly worked in the data space, the data world, for all of my career, and that has mostly been in implementing data governance and data management capabilities. I'm a big believer in getting the foundations right. PwC, as you can see there, it's a multinational professional services network. We have around about 23,000 clients and 20,000 employees in the UK. We operate in a highly regulated environment, so that means we generate a lot of data and it needs to be effectively managed. Okay, so wrestling competition. At this point, I'm just going to set some expectations. There won't actually be any wrestling or any violence of any kind during this webinar, or indeed at the presentation in November. So if you have got the wrong idea about the contents of this presentation, please do take the opportunity to log off now. In fact, the title and description are just a really light-hearted way to describe one of the most common challenges in a data governance initiative, or probably a data initiative of any kind, and that is managing stakeholders and leading people on the change journey. So all credit for this quirky title and description goes to an ex-colleague and friend of mine, but I think most of us who have worked in data governance and data management can relate to the humour of this description. What's interesting for me is that data governance and data management are now recognised as essential to all organisations. This wasn't always the case, but things like GDPR, enabling digital transformation, becoming data-driven or data-informed, and the value of the decision-making on the back of that, the amount of data visualization and data wrangling tools that are now frequently available, all mean that actually data governance and data management is a very necessary activity. And in fact, climbing the data maturity ladder isn't about leading the pack anymore. It's about staying with the pack and surviving in what is now effectively a data-enabled world. But for data organizations to climb the data maturity journey, they have to have a culture that supports data strategy. Otherwise, we do see challenges and failures which are well documented. For me, I've always tried to approach data governance and data management activities by aligning some of the best practices from change management gurus and disciplines with the best practice from the data management frameworks as well, and moulding those together to guide and inform my approach. So today, match day program, there are a number of change management approaches and methodologies out there. One of my favorites is John Kotter's 8-step process. I like the simplicity of it, and that's what I'll be talking to you about today. I'll go through, because we've got limited time, I'll go through the first 3 steps, which is phase 1, which is about creating the climate for change. I will go through some of the typical activities that I've undertaken in each of these steps, and I'll also talk about some of the lessons learned and bruises I've got along the way. I've also included some resources I thought you might find helpful if you are navigating your own data journey. Should have time for some questions and answers as well, especially if I keep myself to time. Okay, So before we try to slightly move away from the wrestling analogy, I wanted to just touch on why data governance and data management initiatives are seen as difficult to obtain success with and difficult to manage and address. I think the stats, from what I can see now, have flipped on their head. As to my earlier point, we now, all the sort of CEO surveys state that data governance and data management is a priority. Those stats were quite low years ago, but actually the stats around successful data initiatives, data governance or big data initiatives are lacking really, and a little bit disappointing. And if you research or read into what causes these perceived failures or lack of success, it's usually comes down to things like culture, stakeholders, communication, lack of vision, all these things that I've sort of included on here. And I think most of the reasoning does gravitate towards stakeholders just weren't brought on the journey. I've included one myself just down on the bottom there, which is not this again. And I'll leave you to reflect on whether you've heard variations of that statement on your journey as well. That can be a little bit off-putting when you're first starting, but there you go. Okay, so on to John Kotter's 8-step process. So John Kotter, he's a world-renowned change expert guru. He introduced his 8-step process in his book in 1995, Leading Change. He developed his methodology by analysing, reviewing successful organizational changes and also looking at some of the failures and looking at what caused both those things, and then setting out the different steps that he felt would help to make sure that change was actually successful. So these steps aren't linear, they're iterative, some will occur simultaneously and or continuously. The first 3 are really about getting, sorry, animation's gone a little bit quick there. First 3 are about getting buy-in and building the case for change and getting some commitment from people who are your early adopters. Steps 4 to 6 are about enabling and engaging the organisation and really starting to take the vision forward, empowering action, and actually starting to see some benefit through some quick wins. And then the last 2 stages, 7 and 8, are about sustaining and embedding the change. I think this might be where a lot of change and data change initiatives actually fail. I think for data governance and data management, you really need to see a change in culture, a change in behaviours, a change in processes for the changes that are introduced to endure. And I think that potentially is one of the most challenging things about data governance and data management capability and introducing it into an organisation. So from my perspective, I would think the 7 and 8 is a tough area to navigate through with your change. Okay, so moving away from the wrestling onto something calmer, I'll start to go through the first 3 steps of the process, and this is about creating the climate for change. So step 1, this is about creating a sense of urgency. It's about demonstrating the value and importance of the change that you are looking to introduce. It's about getting enough people at the right level to care about the change that you're wanting to make. Kotter says for change to be successful, that you need about 75% of management to buy in to that change. Now, you certainly won't get that in step 1 at these early stages, or you're unlikely to anyway, but this step is very much a foundation to get to that 75%. So step 1 requires a lot of research and information gathering. It takes all your skills in this area for step 1. Stakeholder analysis is really key at this point, because you're analysing and making conscious decisions about who you want to speak to and what about, and so that you can formulate a plan to engage the right stakeholders. So for example, if you were going to speak to stakeholders and say your risk department, you want to go prepared about why data is important to, say, regulation or risks that the organization might be facing. On the other hand, if you're going to speak to your marketing department or your marketing function, you might want to go with some stats around how data can help you understand your consumer base better. So I would always suggest drawing out who your stakeholders are and what they are likely to want to know in order to buy in to what you're suggesting and what your changes are. Data risk and issues log I've listed here, that's a really handy way of just pulling together and consolidating what you know about the data quality challenges and the risks in the organisation, so you've got them to hand and they're clearly documented. And then more on the offence side, reviewing and working with your change and transformation department around the upcoming programme and project portfolio. Where are there projects that may be impacted by poor data quality, where there would actually be an additional cost, and where could you help improve the overarching product that comes from this change initiative by improving and making sure that there's better data? Having all these things to hand and understanding your organisation will really help you engage stakeholders and get that buy-in that you need. I also put maturity comparisons here because for some people and some stakeholders, comparing your organisation maturity-wise to what others are doing, either your competitors or other organisations in your industry or sector, that can be quite useful as well. I've included a couple of useful resources here. Anyone who's ever worked with me, and I think there might be a couple on this webinar today, will know that one of the first things I always do is get out Danette McGilvray's Execution Data Quality Projects book. This is a great book for data quality projects, but also it's got some really useful and simple to use templates in there as well, which will help you understand a bit more about the data quality issues in your organisation. And David's book as well gives you a little bit more in-depth information about how to manage data quality. Okay, so lessons learned. One of the things that I think it's a trap we all fall into is using generic concepts and industry phrases, but from my perspective, to really get commitment and buy-in, just saying things like data is the new oil don't work. It's just noise to people. You really need to demonstrate why improving and managing data is important for your organisation. I'd also suggest picking focus areas and not trying to understand absolutely everything about your organisation, because you'll probably never get there and it'll just take too long for you to move on with the activity and the initiative. So just try not to boil the ocean, as they say, and just pick some key areas that you can work with. And then this last point, find the teams and individuals who already care. So back to the wrestling analogy, all those people in that wrestling analogy all had a vested interest in data and either using it or managing it. And these are the people that you should be gravitating towards and working with, especially in the early stages of your initiative, finding out where your common goals and shared goals are. I find a Venn diagram quite helpful to communicate out and work with stakeholders to work out where exactly you've got crossovers and where they own different parts of the journey as well. Okay, so moving on to step 2. So this is about building your team. It's getting more formal commitment from the key stakeholders that you've been engaging with in the previous stages and establishing a decision-making framework so you can start to move forward with your initiative. Formalizing commitment from stakeholders will help endure the change over time. And by looking at what roles and responsibilities they have and actually what part they play in the decision-making process, this helps to cement their involvement and engagement with your initiative, because you really need people who are bought into this emotionally and invested. But even if they are, there'll be a lot of other things going on and they'll have a lot of other stuff coming across the desk. So by formalizing some of the structure around your initiative and their engagement with it, it does help to embed that change with them. So stakeholder management communication plan, probably top of the list here for setting out who you want to target, what role they would do, and making sure that you continue to keep them engaged and continue to communicate with them. In terms of your decision-making framework, I would always urge you to try and align to your existing organizational governance structure. So if your organization talks about committees or forums, you use the same language, you try and use the same language to refer to the terms of reference, and just try to integrate it into the governance of the organization as it is. At this point, best practice would always say trying to set up a data governance committee. Yes, that is best practice, and I've had varied success with this through my career. Some organizations I have been able to establish a committee quite quickly, and others not as quickly. So I would say that if you can establish a committee, great, go ahead and do that. But if not, just try to either align to an existing decision-making forum, whether it's an agenda item or someone who's sponsoring you on that decision-making forum, and then in time you should get your committee. It's at this point as well that I would look to design and start to socialize a data ownership model. It's unlikely, once again, that you'll get a fully fledged data ownership model up and running at this stage of your initiative, but it is helpful to set out the vision around ownership, what it would mean, what it would look like, and perhaps put some names in the frame so that you can start to talk to those people and get them warmed up to the idea that this could be their role in the data journey. I'd also include in any of that so information about how the data ownership model would be supportive, absolutely what it means to be a data owner and how it would work in practice, what sort of time commitment, etc. So a couple of resources there, the non-invasive data governance book, or Robert writes some articles as well in more bite-sized chunks. That's really, really helpful. And also the Effective Change Manager's Handbook. The handbook's useful for all the steps, but it just fitted nicely on my slide there, so I've included it under step 2. So things learned along the way for me. Getting the right people involved takes time, lots of meetings, listening to people, going away, picking up actions, going back with more information. So it does take a lot of energy and time, so don't underestimate how much time it actually takes to move through that. Also, stakeholder involvement often changes. So I would say grab your early adopters with both hands. They might not be the people that you expected to be involved or to sponsor, but if they're emotionally involved and committed to it and can see why you're trying to do what you're trying to do, then they're absolutely the people that you should be working with. Their roles may change over time, but to start with, go with your early adopters and work with them closely. And as always, keep your stakeholders engaged, keep them up to date with what's going on. Otherwise, as the point I made earlier, things will come across their desk and priorities will change and their attention will go elsewhere. But if you keep communicating about progress you're making and what you need from them, then they will hopefully stay engaged with what you're trying to do. Okay, so on to the last step, creating the vision. Developing a compelling vision is really, really important, because if you have a clear vision, it'll tell people why you're trying to do what you're trying to do. And even if they're fully not engaged with it, they'll understand why you're asking them to take different actions or to do things differently. From that vision, you then, of course, need a strategy and a more detailed plan as well. Otherwise, you'll just be talking about the vision for about 2 years and never move anywhere, and people will lose interest if you just keep talking about the vision. So I would, in order to take the vision into a bit more reality and into delivery mode, I would suggest starting with a maturity assessment of where your organization currently is, what your target level of maturity is, and what the timelines are around that. So target maturity can come from things like regulation, strategic objectives, risks or issues that you know about. It doesn't have to be, oh, well, we're at level 1 now and we want to be level 5. In fact, that's actually a big jump. So I would suggest tying in what you think your targets are to something that is realistic for your organization. Maturity assessment can either be done in-house, desktop assessment, or third-party led, and I've included some resources at the bottom there that you might want to look into a bit more if you're thinking about doing that. From that maturity assessment, you can then confirm your direction of travel with your team and your guiding stakeholders and get them to agree that this is where you're trying to go and within these timescales. From that, you can set out your delivery roadmap in more detail. What are the actions you're actually going to take and when are you going to deliver them by? I would always urge you with this to look for delivery mechanisms in your existing initiatives and projects. From the previous steps, you should be aware of what your organisation has got ongoing, what projects or programmes are upcoming, and I would always look for opportunities to include some activities within those projects. It helps you with much needed resource, it helps deliver value straight away, hopefully, and helps you get the organisation to the strategic objectives that they want. This in turn helps you get more buy-in from stakeholders because they can really see the value in what you're trying to achieve, which will just help you move forward. So what have I learned about this stage? Well, set realistic targets and milestones. For depending on the scope of what you're trying to do, this could be a really big initiative and a really big change journey. So by setting sort of unrealistic targets, by promising people that they're going to have a moon on a stick in 3 months, that's really not likely to happen, and you'll lose credibility quite quickly if you don't deliver. Related to that is making sure that you do report on progress. Agree up front what it is you're going to report on when, stick to that and keep up the momentum with that. Keep your stakeholders engaged, and always ask for help from your guiding team as well. They are there to help support you with challenges and to take decisions and help you move things forward as well. And actually that will continue to keep them engaged if they feel actually they are helping you on that journey. And the final point here, which is about just keep communicating, keep your stakeholders engaged, keep telling them what's going on, keep them invested, listen to them if they say they're unsure what's happening, and then try and address that. Okay, so before I go on to Q&A, just to say thank you for joining me today. In November, I'll be joined by Jocelyn. We'll present all 9 steps with some tales from our organisation and some sample templates as well that we're using that are helping us on our journey within PwC. So hopefully I'll see some of you there and get to meet you in person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellie. And we have a few questions, please. First question, how do you define data ownership for an organization?
It's probably the most commonly asked question, I think, data ownership. My approach is always to lift it up to a level that's almost at sort of conceptual data model level. So customer finance, what I would refer to as domains. So large groupings of related data, and have almost sort of a presidential model where you have one data owner and then a more granular data ownership model underneath that with supporting data owners. So rather than linking data ownership to systems or particular departments, lifted up to that sort of subject area. My reasoning for that, and it's quite common across the industry, is because data moves between systems, it moves between departments, and what you don't want is siloed decision making on your data, because that's where you start to introduce data quality issues. So by lifting it up to a level, you get that consistent decision making for data as it moves through your organization.
Thank you. Another question, please. And that is, what is the best way to communicate with and keep stakeholders engaged in the journey?
So I referred to a few in the presentation, and that is about making sure that the stakeholders that you're close to are included in progress reports, decision making, and that you don't sort of just go completely within your team to try and move your data initiative forward, that actually you involve stakeholders in the decision making process and the journey as well. I think more broadly to that, I would always urge you to plug into your organization's existing communication channels. So if there's weekly newsletters or an intranet site, whatever it is, to plug into those and to use those mechanisms to help you communicate out what you're doing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ellie, and thanks to everyone who joined the webinar today, and a final thank you to Ellie.
Thanks, Shane, and thanks everyone for joining.